is Wink Tracks the Tropics, powered by the Weather Authority.
When the tropics are active, timing is everything. The Weather Authority is keeping you prepared.
The latest update did come in from the National Hurricane Center. Helene moving north-northeast. Winds have increased up to 90 miles per hour.
Keeping you informed.
It's now 170 miles northwest of us. And as we had mentioned, this is a major Cat 4 hurricane. This is going to have major landfall implications.
Southwest Florida has seen its fair share of storms in the past few years.
We are leaving immediately after this because it is not safe. You're starting to see some of these debris, sticks flying up and out, and it's one of the reasons why Sanibel is evacuated. It clearly is not safe out here.
But our slice of paradise has bounced back in ways we'd never expect.
It was tough.
We had each other, and that's a good thing.
I wouldn't have made it without Marianne. We're gonna make it, though. We're gonna make it.
Wink News has been there with you every step of the way, and that won't change.
Yes, we avoid the worst part of the storm, but the wind field's growing and the pressures are deepening. We're going to feel more of that influence on the back end with the surge.
From forecast cones to important safety reminders, the Weather Authority has you covered. You're watching Wink Tracks the Tropics. Hello, everybody. Welcome to Wink Tracks the Tropics. I'm Wink's Weather Authority Val Simpson, and today marks 1 year since Hurricane Milton. Hurricane Milton, even though it didn't make landfall here in our viewing area, it brought Southwest Florida tons of impact. We saw devastating winds, flooding, and perhaps one of the biggest tornadoes outbreaks that the state of Florida has ever seen. That is why today we choose to do things a little bit differently, and we're going to really focus on what we saw a year ago, today, and also what we've learned from this hurricane. And to do so, of course, I'm going to do that with our panel of judges. And before we start, guys, I do want to mention that we are an interactive platform. This means that you can send us your comments and your questions in real time, and we will be reading them and sharing them out loud. And I want to start off with one comment coming in from YouTube. This is from Kevin Hawthorne. He says, "Good morning from Lakeland, Florida." They're actually watching us in Lakeland, you guys.
That's awesome. Great. Good morning.
Good morning. Tim also just logged in. He's saying good morning to everybody. But we have a lot to get to. I want to ask you this before I start doing a little breakdown. Did all of you cover Milton?
Yeah.
Yeah.
You all did? And how was that? Can you give us a little description of what it was like a year ago today?
I think in terms of Southwest Florida, the biggest thing was we were coming after 2 weeks, almost 2 weeks after Helene. Where we had a similar type of threat of the storm surge. We didn't have as many tornadoes touch down during Helene. We had many warnings, though, with Helene. And even Debbie in the August prior to that, almost a year and a half ago now, we had another system that brought some minor storm surge, and we had a lot of warnings, but no actual tornadoes. So in terms of the difference from Helene versus Milton, and even Debbie versus Helene versus Milton, Milton was one of the really the third hurricane we were tracking last year, where we finally saw warnings, and then we saw rotation on our radar, and then we had ground truth of seeing tornadoes live on our FDOT cameras, on our Mount Lachey cameras, on our cameras near Clewiston and Moorhaven, and we finally realized that this was a hurricane that was producing tornadoes actually versus just getting a bunch of warnings that weren't producing much. So that was the biggest difference. Obviously, we had the storm surge. The storm surge was similar, Helene and Milton back to back here in downtown Fort Myers, as well as across the entire coast. More so an impact towards Manasota Key because of where that storm and angle of attack was coming from. But locally, it was just, I still joke with Chief Meteorologist Matt Devitt that we're still just as tired, now after that back-to-back Helene Milton, even though it's been a year after that.
Yeah. How was the experience for you guys?
I mean, I think one thing that I do want to talk about is like for our viewers, the people here, it was a rough couple of weeks just because for those viewers further to the north, more so in Charlotte County, they were impacted with the surge and the damage from Helene, and they didn't even really have enough time to pick up all that trash before Milton came back through and just caused another mess of everything. So that was really devastating to see and exhausting for everybody here in Southwest Florida.
Yeah. Would you say, Josh, that hurricane fatigue is a real thing?
Oh, it absolutely is, and especially this one, because it was such a case where you had all these different factors that were actually doing the most impact versus when everyone thinks of a hurricane, you normally just think of the winds, right? But in this one, the two biggest problem causers obviously were the surge and also the tornadoes, two things that sometimes can be forgotten in the midst of, oh, we have a major hurricane that's packing 120-mile-per-hour winds, whereas the winds were not exactly the issue. The surge, the freshwater flooding up near Tampa Bay, and of course the tornadoes were the biggest issues.
And I think, Val, just to step in with real second, we know that Josh is one of the newer meteorologists here, but I think he's had more hurricane fatigue than us sometimes because when he was working in the Big Bend, he had Idalia make landfall. He had Debbie make landfall when it was a Category 1. He had Helene approach, and Milton was just far enough south of him. But yeah, if anyone could join the group and have the experience, I think we're happy to have Josh here because he covered everything that we had to cover here, just not as local as he was. And now that he's here, he brought us some good weather, I think.
Safe to say I'm enjoying my hurricane season so
far. Yeah, you brought us good luck, that's for sure. And if you're watching and if you're tuned in, we want to hear about your memories as well from a year ago today. How did you experience Milton, especially if you are in the Southwest Florida region or if you're in the Tampa area as well? We'd like to hear from you. Okay, guys, let's go ahead and take it away. I have a quick little review here. I'm going to do a very fast tropical weather outlook so that you can see what's going on currently and what we're watching and tracking in the tropics. Of course, we have Tropical Storm Jerry still there, trying to get its act together. It is steering and hinting a little bit more to the west, but no big concerns here for us in Southwest Florida. You can see that the area that was in the Bay of Campeche is no longer. And now there's a 10% chance for a low pressure area that we're watching that's hundreds of miles from the Azores. But we are going to mention it because, as you can see, the National Hurricane Center has that up for us. Let's take a look at the latest information with Tropical Storm Jerry, because as you know, it will be expected to become a hurricane sometime this weekend. So right now it's producing max sustained winds at 65 miles per hour. It is moving west-northwest at 18 miles per hour, and you can notice that it's moving just a little bit slower. It's still pretty fast, but it's moving just a little bit slower than what it's been in the last few days. I want you to notice the proximity to the Leeward Islands because they are expected, or at least the northern area of Leeward Islands is expected to see tropical storm conditions here in the next day or so. And let's take a look at the cone. And what I was sharing with you was that it's likely that it will become a Cat 1 hurricane probably as we move into the weekend. So Saturday morning, it'll continue to stay Cat 1 hurricane. At this point, a fish storm, notice how it's going to make that curve. It looks like Bermuda, you are in, it's all good on you too because it's going to be making that curve south of Bermuda, southeast. So they might not need to worry about that at all. They're not in that cone, even though we do need to keep in mind that some of the outer impacts, that's always something that we need to look at. However, it is a low Cat hurricane. Okay, and with that being said, let's put our focus now. I want to share this with you. Look at this Milton on radar. Look at the size of this storm. A couple of things that I want to point out here. Look at where the center of the storm is, where it was making landfall. I want you to notice two things. One, north of where the center of the storm is, look at all that rain. Those are the areas that got everything that you see in yellow and red. Those are the areas that we saw the most rain accumulations. And now I want you to look at the center and look south. Those are the areas that were affected the most with storm surge, which was one of the things that we were just talking about in terms of what were some of those the biggest impacts. When we talk about Milton, we remember that it was a storm that started off in the Gulf. Notice that at its peak, it reached a Cat 5 hurricane. It went through a rapid intensification, and it had 180 mile per hour winds. However, as it continued to move in the Gulf towards Florida, it became a Cat 3 hurricane. It lost some of its intensity with 150 mile per hour winds. Some of the things that we will remember Milton for is that, well, it definitely triggered one of the biggest tornado outbreaks that Florida has ever seen. There were about 45 confirmed tornadoes. We're going to talk about that in just a little bit. It caused catastrophic wind, flooding, and structure damage across the state of Florida, and at least 42 deaths, direct and indirect, with a total cause of an economic damage of $34.3 billion. Now, I know that when we started discussing Milton, especially for us here in Southwest Florida, we could say that one of the biggest impacts, Zach, was the storm surge. What can you tell us about that?
Yeah, before I jump into the storm surge real quick, Val, question for you, because you were up at a Tampa station during Milton. You were with a part of a weather team up there.
Yeah.
And I know, we have that viewer who's watching right now in Lakeland. Lakeland is the home to part of the hurricane hunters. I got to interview a number of them, I think this past May. And a couple of them who live in Lakeland actually have their homes flooded because the pumps stopped working in their backyard ponds. So not storm surge, but the ponds overflowed, and it flooded some of their homes with freshwater flooding because of how much rain they had. We barely had any rain. We had the big bands of rain that passed through with the tornadoes. But for us here in Southwest Florida with Milton, we did not have that rain from freshwater flooding. Can you speak on your experience from being up in Tampa and how impactful that freshwater flooding was up in that area, just to fill us in as well?
Absolutely. We actually saw, after the pass of Milton, days where we were seeing rivers that were rising, and it was moving into neighborhoods. People that were not expecting to, they were not close to, like you were just saying, they were not close to the coastal areas, yet we were seeing the impacts that we were having days after the storm had already made landfall and was long and gone, and yet we were seeing the impacts of these rivers and moving into, like I said, residential businesses, and people not understanding what was going on, sometimes even blaming the infrastructure perhaps of the neighborhoods. But this is something also that we've learned from this. I think that this is something that, towards the end when we're going to mention the highlights, that, like we were saying before, it's not just winds. When we think about a hurricane, freshwater flooding was also a huge impact, especially for the Tampa area as well. But I do have to say that one of the things that surprised us the most, and that we were not forecasting perhaps leading to Milton, was the tornado outbreak. I think that was something that, that we were, and I remember at the time, people over on the East Coast kept on sending us messages regarding what can we expect, and the impacts we were like, well, you guys are not going to see a lot of the rain, you guys are not going to see a lot of the wind, maybe some of those outer bands, but we were not expecting that tornado. That did catch us by surprise, I do have to say.
Yeah, I would agree with that too, just when I spoke about that a second ago, with that comparison between the past hurricanes not having as many. But jumping into the surge, like you mentioned, Val, the biggest thing with the surge, I just wanted to show you first the storm surge forecast. This was the most recently updated storm surge forecast. This was the last forecast we had before Milton was on its final approach to make landfall. This was the forecast that caused the evacuations, whether it was Zone A or Zone B, voluntary evacuations even as far south as Collier County. I'm showing you this because this is what it typically looks like when we're talking to you guys on TV and we're showing you these graphics and this information. We're showing you a holistic type of forecast that could be met with what is going to be heading its way, and it depends on where the landfall is. So let's skip to the next graphic, and I could show you that based on how this storm was moving on shore, you could see that the eye, like Val mentioned, was passing almost near the Sarasota County border, north, of course, of Charlotte County, made landfall just north of Sarasota itself, almost near the Bradenton area, if you know that area pretty well, where I-275 begins on I-75 north. That's basically where that storm passed overhead. So going to the next graphic, you can see where the storm surge really was at in terms of its finalized amount. Now, you have to keep in mind with where the storm made landfall. And this was a big thing, unfortunately, for Tampa meteorologists and just Tampa individuals in general, that they had to learn that the most impactful storm surge happens south and east of where the storm makes landfall. Now, in Milton's case, it happens usually to the right of where the storm is heading. So this storm is heading east-northeast. We'll call it almost a 20-degree movement, moving off towards the east-northeasterly direction. All this storm surge gets piled up right of where that storm's heading is, and that's why we had that 10-foot storm surge. We go to the next graphic too. It has some of the information. 10-foot storm surge in Manasota Key, almost 7 feet of storm surge in Venice. Even downtown Fort Myers had over 5 feet of storm surge. Captiva had almost 7 feet of storm surge. And I just wanted to explain this in more detail just because a lot of individuals, when we do all of our hurricane talks, they are still often confused on why the storm surge happens or where exactly it gets trapped and why it doesn't totally match up with the initial forecast sometimes. It directly coincides with where the storm makes landfall, and because of the way the motion of the storm is going, because of the winds moving counterclockwise, because the storm is moving off towards the east-northeast, it's why we call the right side of the storm the dirty side of the storm. You get this added physics equation to it. You get this other physical dimension to the wind, that wind-driven surge is always greater on the right side of the storm versus the left side of the storm. And that's why Tampa still had some surge. It had a negative surge when the storm was approaching. Then it had this storm surge on the back side of the storm system. But you could see far less than that 10 to 12 foot storm surge forecast that they were being called for. And I wanted to bring that up just because they almost are going to have what I call the Irma effect. The psychological impact of being forecast into a pattern that could have 10 to 15 feet of storm surge, only to end up with a foot to 3 feet of storm surge. We had the same thing in Hurricane Irma in 2017. We were calling for 9, 10 feet of storm surge. Storms made landfall. Marco Island, the right side of the storm was Everglades City. They had 10 feet of storm surge. The left side of the storm was over the water and not really impacting land, and we only had 1 to 3 feet of storm surge, and that created this comfortability level where people would go, hey, they were calling for this, and then it didn't happen. And the reason why it didn't happen is because everything on the coast of Florida was on the left side of the storm. So it's always an impact. My final statement there, it's always an impact on where the storm makes landfall at. The storm surge is always greatest on the right side of where the storm makes landfall at. You will still have some storm surge on the left side, but it will be dramatically lower compared to where the storm makes landfall. So it's hard to forecast, and I can let the others weigh in too. It's hard to forecast that specific narrow path because you have to evacuate enough people early enough to get them out of the possibility of getting the impact. And then when the storm shifts, 3 hours, 6 hours before it makes landfall, that's why we have that massive shift in what actually happens versus what is forecast when it comes to storm surge.
I do have to say that this would have been a very different story for the Tampa Bay area in the event that the storm would have made landfall close to St. Pete or north of St. Pete. One of the things that we were watching when we were the night of was basically where is it going to make landfall? Because there's always that error or that space for error, right? And it was significant. It made landfall in Siesta Key, around very close to Siesta Key, which is south of Tampa. And I think that pretty much saved the Tampa Bay area, which is, and what I'm saying with that is that it's a heavily populated area, both St. Pete and the Tampa Bay. It would have been catastrophic if it would have made landfall in the bay, basically, or north of the bay. Absolutely.
Yeah, and think of like what we had here during Ian, Sanibel Causeway, most of the causeway getting washed out. For those of you who've been on 275 North before you hit the big bridge right there, the Skyway Bridge, you have that same low-lying area on 275 before all the fishing piers right there. And after Ian, even though Tampa didn't have the impacts of Ian, that area was working really hard to put these big concrete cylinders and blocks blocking those low-lying areas of I-275 because of that possibility of that part of the roadway being washed away. It would have been tested, like Val said, if that storm happened to make landfall in St. Petersburg, maybe even off towards, just to the north of that. But in terms of it making landfall to the south, Tampa has still been untested to see how the structure of the city and how it is
Tampa
now, compared to, if they had a hurricane that would hit a little bit farther north.
Tampa says that they are being saved by the Indian burial grounds. That's what they say. They're protected. They're protected. Yeah. That's why they never get a direct hit. I know that other impacts that we saw were wind and rain, and I know that, Nikki, you've been doing some research on that. What can you share with us today on what happened, what we saw with Milton?
Well, like you were saying earlier, Milton rapidly intensified. So when it was offshore in the Gulf, it was a Cat 5, a powerful storm with sustained winds of 180 miles per hour. Luckily, it did weaken a bit before landfall, but it was still a major hurricane, still a devastating hurricane, as it was a Category 3 storm with sustained winds of, I believe, 115 miles per hour. Now, for us here in Southwest Florida, wind wasn't the big issue for us, but it still led to some impacts. And I do have a couple of numbers I want to show you guys over the development of Milton for you guys to see how those winds rapidly intensified, and then once Milton worked its way over land, it began to lose its steam. So rapid intensification is when sustained winds increase by at least 35 miles per hour in a 24-hour period. And when we talk about sustained winds, that's the average wind speed over a 2-minute period. So that's what the difference between sustained winds and gusts. So you can see Milton, once it became a hurricane October 6th, rapidly intensified within that 24-hour period, well over that 35 mile per hour limit there. So it continued to strengthen as we head into October 7th, and then again it did begin to weaken a bit as it approached the coast. Now for us locally, Pagefield reported their peak gust at 55 miles per hour, Naples at 58 miles per hour, but then as you push to the north, closer to the center of the storm, Punta Gorda at their airport, they actually got a gust of 81 miles per hour. So again, the winds were significantly different the further north that you did go with this system. And then also talking about the rainfall, more of the same. The further north you went, the more rainfall we saw when it came to Milton. So it wasn't a huge rainmaker like what we were talking about earlier for us here in Southwest Florida. Fort Myers Beach just getting over 3 inches, same in Naples. And then take a look at Tampa, 16.5 inches of rainfall when it came to the entirety of the rain with Milton. Port Charlotte, a little bit more rain than what we saw in Lee and Collier counties, just again because it was closer to the center of the storm. So I know something that we talk about a lot as meteorologists is you want to protect yourself from the wind and the rain, but you want to evacuate because of the surge, and it was a huge surge event for us here locally, not so much wind and rain.
Yeah, Nikki, you and I off camera, we were talking about some of the effects that the damage that we saw in St. Pete particularly, and I want to see if Andrew can punch this picture so that we can share it. This is from Tropicana Field. It's a picture from NOAA. This is the wind damage that they saw in St. Pete at Tropicana Field. This picture went viral basically because of the impacts. At the time, they were saying that it could have been used perhaps as a shelter. Good thing that they didn't. It could have been much worse. But it makes sense basically when we look at that radar, that loop radar, because of where the rain and the wind was, which was north of the center.
Yeah, definitely more of an impact for them when it came to wind and rain.
Yeah, absolutely. And but I guess one of the things that we've been mentioning through the stream today was the outbreak of tornadoes. I know that is something that Josh was talking to us about, and I know, Josh, you've been looking into it. So how many total tornadoes were there confirmed?
I believe there was 45. Is that right? Yeah, 45 across the state. And when it comes to tornadoes and tropical systems, I know it's not the first thing that comes to mind, right? But it's a real problem that we have to consider into the equation of all of the different impacts from tropical systems. Now, when it comes to where we see these tornadoes, generally, Zach was talking about the dirty side of a storm. The north and eastern quadrant of the storm is where you see most of that tornadic activity. There's a lot of factors as to why that is. One of the leading ones, something called wind shear. That's winds moving at different speeds in different directions at different levels of the atmosphere. So pretty much when you get these tropical systems that start to move onshore to land, all of a sudden you have the winds at the surface getting slowed down by friction because it starts to interact with the land. But the winds right above it in the upper levels of the atmosphere, those are still moving really fast. So all of a sudden you have winds moving at different speeds, at different levels. Then you start to get some spin in the environment. And if you get those rain bands that line up just in the right spot, that's where you get that issues with those tropical tornadic events. That's exactly what happened there with Milton. You could see all of the tracks there spanning all the way from close to home here in Southwest Florida, all throughout the interior of the state, and especially on the East Coast. And these weren't your typical tropical tornadoes. I mean, these were some big ones. We had EF2s, EF3s in there, so that's certainly something that it was not exactly expected in terms of the intensity of these tornadoes, but seeing the tornadoes is something that we're always absolutely going to put into that equation. There's one of them right there that came straight through Fort Myers, East Cape, North Fort Myers. It started off there, the Villas community, made its way all the way through just to the west there of Page Field, up through McGregor, all of a sudden crossed the Caloosahatchee. I mean, this one spanned for a long time, right? Again, typically when you see these tropical tornadoes, they're weaker and they don't last this long. Of course, this is an outlier. EF2, winds of 132 miles per hour, is on the ground for 16 miles. It's a long time for a tornado, and unfortunately, it did leave quite a bit of destruction in its path before it eventually started to lift as it got there near US 41 and North Fort Myers.
Yeah, that's definitely something that very interesting to have seen all this going on, right? The tornadoes, I guess, and all that storm surge that we saw. Guys, I'm going to take a break because we have some questions coming in on YouTube and some comments too. Tim wants to let us know that he had family visiting during Milton from Maryland and that they were losing their minds because every few minutes the tornado warning alarm would sound off. So they were very nervous about that. He has a question for you guys. He wants to know if you have or would fly with a hurricane hunter.
No, that's a hard no.
Oh, I would.
Oh, I would. Yeah, I would fly.
You would do it?
I almost did it a couple of years ago. You could fly with either the C-130 sometimes, but usually you'll fly in one of the P-3 Orions that they have. Miss Peggy or Kermit is what they're notably called. They're the two aircraft that are stationed in Lakeland, by the way. Usually you'll be on board with those as a media personnel to fly through that. But I mean, I thought about it, and it's just a lot of cloud cover, a lot of bumpiness, a lot of rain for a long time, and then you get maybe 5-10 minutes of gorgeous view of going through the eye, and then a full-on another hour and a half, 2 hours. It sounds exhilarating until I really thought about it. It's like being a pilot, where it sounds so much fun to take off and to land, but then you have 3 hours of just kind of sitting there letting it do its thing. I'm sure that would get a little daunting and exhausting after a while. Then you have one person just to run the engines up and down to make sure you're staying at the correct flight level. I mean, think of how much goes into flying in a hurricane when you have one person's job just to rev it up, rev it back, rev it up, rev it back, because both the other guys have their hands very firm on the sticks to make sure that you're controlling the aircraft at all times. Yeah.
I've seen videos of what happens inside a Hurricane Hunter airplane, and it's really, I mean, it's scary because I don't do well with turbulence as it is in a normal, regular flight, but I do admire that there are people that do this for us, because if not, you guys, it's amazing how technology now, the advancements, and how we're able to get this information if we didn't have brave folks like those hurricane hunters flying up and
tough to get a bathroom break in. I mean, with that turbulence going on, I don't know how you
put the fasten seatbelt light on for a good amount of that ride.
That's right. Well, we're running out of time. I do have a question that came up in our Weather Watcher group, so we do want to answer that. Let me pull that up really quick, you guys, because I know that there are some weather watchers that were waiting for this to be answered. Let me see. I think it's in my emails, actually. Give me 1 second. And I know, Josh, you had been
I can kind of talk about it while you're pulling it up.
We can do a deep dive on it, too, because it might take some time to fill it. That's something we could slowly answer over the coming days, too, because there's a lot that goes into that question,
that goes into this?
Yeah.
Should we do kind of like, I'll read it out loud. We're going to work on it for you, and we'll get back to you. Tune in, maybe tomorrow.
There's a teaser for tomorrow. I like that.
Should we leave it for tomorrow?
Teaser for Friday. Yeah.
But this is the question we're going to be answering tomorrow. You're going to want to tune in if you want to hear what this is all about. It says, okay. In your professional opinion, considering the cold front coming through this weekend, everybody's excited about that. Yeah. I have heard that it may be strong enough to turn off rainy season. Do you think it can potentially turn off our tropical threats as well for the last 6 weeks of hurricane season?
I'll go with a quick, dirty answer for that. Okay. Yes, it could turn off the rainy season. When I was a meteorologist in Raleigh, North Carolina, I loved when we got to October because the fronts started coming through, and the fronts block tropical systems in that region, and I loved it. Down here, it's a little pro and con because you can have some development along fronts. So if it gets far enough south and the front happens to erode away, you could see some development along those fronts, but short answer for me, it could really block and help us and turn off the hurricane season because it all obviously brings cooler air into the Gulf as well.
Very good. But we'll dig into.
I'm gonna dig. Josh, what do we got real quick?
Josh is gonna dig deep into that tomorrow for us. So you're not gonna want to, guys. Before we leave, real quick. Any highlights from today's episode? What did we learn from Hurricane Milton?
I think one thing I do want to point out, talking about the tornadoes, we actually had our most powerful tornado in Southwest Florida history happen during Milton. It was a Twin Palms tornado. It was an EF3. So, you know, just talking about how much of an impact the tornadic activity had during the system, it actually led to a record-breaking one for us.
Mm-hmm. You guys, anything to close out?
I don't want to do it again. Let's not have a back-to-back hurricane system, but you know, we are ready. We are now well experienced on covering this all for our viewers and friends. So if we have to, we must, but if not, we'll track the cold front this weekend.
That's right. I'm right on board with that.
All right, guys, thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you for viewing and sending your comments and questions. We appreciate that very much, and we'll see you again tomorrow at 11.
Bye.
Adios.